And welcome everyone to another edition of Krown Gridiron Nation on TSN. Look who's back. Mike Hogan is in Toronto, Mr. Double Blue himself. Gord is in Vancouver, and it's Jim here on Football Island getting ready to bring you another edition of the 2-Minute Offense. Let's start you off with Florida State and Pitt. Christian Vier, not great again this week. He's on a learning curve. 15 of 35, 244, one pick, one TD. Penn State should really use Teo Johnson more because this guy can find the end zone. 4 receptions, only 19 yards, but made it to the promised land in a wipeout of Maryland. Tanner McLaughlin, he's Mr. Consistency. 5 receptions for 66 yards, always turning in the stats, and it's a 3rd consecutive win against a ranked team for Arizona. Jet Elad really enjoying his takeoff at UNLV. 5 tackles and a fumble recovery in a convincing win over New Mexico. We're not used to this in the Pac-12, a low-scoring game between Stanford and Wazoo. Elekeo Manor from Medicine Hat, 4 receptions, 53 yards. And it's Keelan White with a highly productive day for Montana. Goes over the century mark and finds the end zone. Now, Gord, we've seen our Canadian players in the NCAA turn in some very big games this year, but they haven't done it with consistency. So if you're a coach or if you're a scout, what do you like better, those high-end games or consistent performances throughout a season?
Well, I think the answer is different depending on the role involved, but I'll start with the coach's perspective, and consistency is what I love from a coach's perspective. Now, consistency doesn't necessarily mean consistent on the stat sheet. It could just be consistent in doing your job and giving a consistent performance, and sometimes that isn't always reflected on the stat sheet, right? I think of receivers on offense, for example. There are a lot of factors that go into whether they come up with that production or not at the end of the day. It could be what the defensive scheme is doing, how your quarterback's playing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those things, the game script could affect that. But if I'm a coach, consistency is the name of the game. I want to be able to count on what I can get out of my players. And in a lot of cases, I'm willing to take the lower potential ceiling with the higher floor as a coach because that just gives me a little bit more certainty.
I would think, maybe from the other perspective, when you're scouting a guy for the pros, from a scout's perspective, you want both. Like you can fall in love with a guy's potential and say, oh man, I know that our coaching staff can take that raw ability and harness it and turn him into a superstar. But at the same time, you want a guy who's going to show that consistency. Let's take a look at, Io Menor's big game where he lit up Colorado. He followed that up with a couple of good performances. If he follows that up with 1 catch for 3 yards, 4 catches for 8 yards, the shine is going to come off that performance. But because, he may have gotten onto some teams' radars because of that performance, he followed it up. And, it's ironic we're talking about this. I was talking with Vince Magri, the Argos assistant GM this year, about scouting. We talked this week about scouting. And we were talking about the quarterback position specifically. And he said, you want to judge a guy, but not on that one game. You want to take a look at that position specifically over a sustained period of time. And, you can fall in love with that guy who's going to throw 9 touchdown passes and 450 yards and, dot the I 15 times over the course of the game. But, if you can see him maybe bring that ceiling down, but be consistent at a high level for 5 or 6 games, that's going to add more value and probably make him more attractive to more organizations.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, when you're taking kids from the college ranks and looking to the professional ranks, that consistency gives you a basis, a foundation that you can build upon to start adding in the much more complex systems, particularly on offense, that you see in the pro ranks. So I think you do need that baseline. But at the same time, I think you also need to see that ceiling of exceptional play at the previous level so you can have some heart that there is something to still be tapped into when they get to the pro level. Because, again, that leap is pretty big, right? And so if you don't feel like a player has that much more to give, we see it all the time, big name college football players that doesn't translate into their pro stock as much as we might have thought. And it's largely because they don't see that extra step left to give in those players. They see them as more or less a finished product. But going to the consistency thing, I would say like a couple of our Canadians have been really impressive in that regard. One of them that stands out for me is Tanner McLaughlin in Arizona, right? And there has been no blow-up games for Tanner McLaughlin. And frankly, as a tight end, that might be the nature of the position. But it feels like clockwork. You can count on him to have somewhere between 4 and 6 catches. You can count on him to have somewhere between 40 and 70 yards. He'll get you a touchdown when needed, right? And that to me is like guys like a rock. He's the outlet valve. It's the 3rd and 5 guy that you're looking to find to turn the chains over. And there's so much value for that in offense. On the defensive side, Jeff Cantana-Aku, another guy, just I wouldn't say complete flatline, but there's been a really noticeable floor of performance for him that sometimes he goes above and beyond, but you feel like you can count on him every single week to give you that.
There are always going to be organizations, though, that fall in love with the workout warriors, the guy that go and they blow the doors off the combine. Sometimes you can maybe fall a little bit too in love with that, but at the same time, the combine can maybe underscore something you were worried about. The guy who you think runs a 4.7 or a 4.8 at receiver, all of a sudden runs a 4.6, and you go, maybe there's a little bit more there, and you might see his draft stock go up. So it's not an exact science, and there's always going to be organizations and scouts that look at different players different ways.
So would it be the consistent guys, the outstanding guys, or both in our Stateside 5? In at 5, it's the big target from Lethbridge, Tanner McLaughlin, 66 yards receiving on 5 snags for Arizona. The native of Saskatoon, Daniel Opoco on the D-line for San Diego State. He had a sack and 3 tackles. Lévis, Quebec's Jeffrey Canton-Arcou. He produces in the middle of that defense at middle linebacker. 7 tackles and a TFL. Keelan White getting that long-distance feeling for Montana, the native of North Vancouver, with only 2 receptions, but he made the most of them. 103 yards and a tutty. Mississauga's Jet Elad, 5 tackles and a fumble recovery for bowl-bound UNLV. It's magic, it's powerful, it's the Power 7, and it's coming up. Welcome back to the mighty KGN, everyone. Well, there's 8 teams remaining in the hunt for the Vanier Cup. How would you fit them all into the Power 7? In at 7, they may be out of the playoffs, but they left an impression on U Sport. The Windsor Lancers. The Alberta Golden Bears come in at 6 after sweeping the Saskatchewan Huskies in 3 games this year. The Laval Rouge et Or remain in at 5 after a double overtime win got them through to the next round. The Laurier Golden Hawks remain steady in at number 4. After a mediocre first half, UBC squeaks out a win against the Manitoba Bisons, so they fall to 3. The Montreal Caravan regain their momentum with a blowout win and pop back up to number 2. And until someone knocks them off, those purple ponies keep stampeding in at number 1. Mike, we have our first non-playoff team in the Power 7, and we're naming them the Windsor Lancers. Are they deserving?
Okay, here's the question or the answer that you guys don't want. Doesn't matter. It's what I love about the Power 7 over the course of the season is it creates discussion. And it allows us to kind of look at different conferences, conference strengths, maybe give a tip of the cap to a team that's starting to climb the ladder and become more competitive, or maybe let folks know that we, as a group that picked the Power 7, think that, okay, that team's a little bit overrated. And right now at this stage of the season, whether it's Windsor, whether it's Queens, whether it's Saskatchewan, whether it's Manitoba, throw the names in a hat, pull one out, stick it up there. Maybe for the team that we do put in that spot, it becomes an advantage in terms of recruiting, because they can say, look, we're now number 6 or 7 or wherever you want to put them in the Power 7. But overall, I mean, I think what the Power 7 tells everybody is we just don't have a lot of respect for AU right now in terms of competing nationally. Maybe they throw it in our face this year, and I'd love if that was the case. But right now, to me, once you get out of the playoffs or into the playoffs, personally, it doesn't matter to me. But I think it's a great story that we're recognizing Windsor for what they did.
Yeah, I would agree with most of what you said there. And, there are probably people that watch this show and are looking at this list and going, really? Like, St. FX can't even crack the top 7 now? And, I mean, the answer is, like you said, like, it kind of goes to show what we think of the AUS. I mean, this is a collaborative process. I think probably if I were just doing it by myself, I might have put SFX in there. But the fact that it's still a question at this point in time does just kind of show where that conference is. And until further notice, that conference has given us no reason to give it any respect over the last better part of a decade now, if we're being honest. So I think the other team that probably should be in this conversation is Saskatchewan. And I would also probably personally argue that they should be in there over Windsor. If you look at the Saskatchewan season, I mean, realistically, their downfall was they couldn't figure out Alberta. 0-3 against the Alberta Golden Bears, and that effectively ends their season. They lost one game the rest of their season, which was them slipping on a banana peel against Calgary. But other than that, they would go 0-3 against the Golden Bears, including last weekend when it matters most. And what let them down is a defense that I thought should have been one of the best defenses in the country, with standout talents and names like Nick Wiebe, like Catley Joseph. Catley Joseph had an interception in that game last weekend, but that secondary was getting picked apart. Eli Hetlinger goes for, I think it was about 285, 2 touchdowns. They put up 40 points total. That's just not going to get it done in a playoff game in November, and not the type of football that you are used to seeing from the Saskatchewan Huskies in the Scott Flory era, and frankly in the Brian Tauris era before that. So that was kind of the downfall of the Huskies this year. But I do think it's being looked into a little bit too much that they really struggled with one of their particular rivals in the conference, and otherwise had a pretty good season.
Now, we don't really know what team UBC is going to be from week to week, but we do know the Laval Rouge et Or have not been the Laval Rouge et Or this year. They finished the season 6-2. They play in a semifinal game where Concordia pushes them to overtime, but they've also had all kinds of distractions around this team. The Kevin Mattel case in preseason leading into the season, and then a few other things that could have been a real distraction. And I'm wondering, Gord, if that has affected the culture of this Laval team.
Well, I don't know. I can't really speak to whether it's affected the culture, but it certainly has affected the on-field performance, and in particular with Kevin Mattel. We're talking the reigning Heck Crichton winner right now, and it's been readily apparent watching him that missing training camp and the other things that he's gone through in the past 6 months. And I'm not trying to be apologetic here. I'm not going to get into the ifs, ands, or buts there. But since he's been back on the field, it's been a completely different guy. A guy that last year could change a game from anywhere on the field, was a big play waiting to happen. That explosiveness, that big play ability, that where the heck is Mattel, it just hasn't really been the case for Laval. He plays in that game last weekend against Concordia, which it takes them double overtime to win. And he records like 2 receptions for 24 yards. And that's his entire line. And that we just straight up did not see in any game last year when he was on route to the Heck Crichton Trophy. So it's very clear that he has been a different player this year. And I can only assume that's because of what he's gone through. In terms of the rest of the question, the distractions of the locker room and stuff like that, I don't know. I will say, like, they got their butts handed to them on aggregate by Montreal this year. And so the good news for them is that they can completely flip that script this upcoming weekend if they pull the Dunsmore Cup victory out of a hat. But as of right now, it doesn't look great for them, given how the previous 2 matchups with Montreal have gone either.
The early in the season, especially the on-field distraction became an on-field problem. But I don't know, and I don't know if we'll ever know if it was a distraction internally. It's a very strong organization. Historically, it's been a very unified organization. And, some programs are able to deal with that better than others. So unless somebody after the season said, yeah, it was apparently bad in the room because of what we were dealing with on a multiple offense or multiple allegation basis. So I don't know, and I don't know if I'll ever know. What I am curious about is how this plays forward, and whether or not there's an effect on this in scouting and recruiting. And, is Montreal going to be able to take advantage of this when it comes down to the elite prospects in that province and saying, you don't want to go to Laval because ... And we might not know for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whether or not this has a major impact in the recruiting cycle, but it just might.
Championship Saturday coming up. We preview them all. And welcome back, everyone. This is my favorite weekend of the year. You've got 4 championships that all line up throughout the home and native land, and these teams are evenly matched in the AUS, the RSEQ, the Canada West, and the OUA. So let's start down east with the Loney Bowl, the AUS championship. And Mike, I want to get your take on the Loney Bowl.
Well, you mentioned that they're evenly matched, and we're seeing the 2 only teams over 500 in that conference go toe-to-toe, so it's appropriate. I just hope from an entertainment standpoint we see a game closer to the second game, the triple overtime game, as opposed to the blowout of the first game. And I'll get into this game a little bit later on when we break down these games, but I'll go with the team that's undefeated so far, and it might not be a stretch, but I'll go with X.
I'm going upset special on this one, and it might be wishful thinking, but when they played in the regular season, granted it was in Lennoxville, so Bishops was at home, whereas they won't be this weekend, but it was a triple OT thriller, 34-31, SFX escapes with the victory. And what was most notable in that game for me was that Bishops held Malcolm Busty, the star running back for St. FX, to just over 3.5 yards a carry, a total of 58 yards. If they can keep the lid on that rushing attack and not let him in the run game for SFX grind them down, I do like their chances here. The big question mark floating over this, though, is that the status of Gabriel Royer is up in the air. He was not part of the game last weekend, and so we don't know whether he's going to play or not at this point in time. But if he's there, he is my favorite defender in that conference, and they're probably my favorite defense on the whole in that conference. I think that they have what it takes on that side of the ball to potentially pull this off. If they can weather the road environment and put up enough points to keep pace, I think they can pull it off. So from talking about the Quebec expat school, we'll slide over to their home province and the rest of the teams in the RSEQ, and we'll look at the Dunsmore Cup. And of course, no surprise, guys, it's Montreal-Laval round 3 for what feels like the upteenth year in a row. This year has been a little bit different for that Montreal-Laval series, though. As we talked about earlier on the show, Montreal has won both matchups by multiple scores, and scores into the high 20s and 30s, which most people who don't pay close attention to U Sports might think, well, whatever. But those who do pay close attention will go, wow, that's offensive fireworks right there. So it'll be interesting to see if that dynamic keeps up, because we have made a big deal on this show, or at least I have, of maybe this is the end of the rock fight days for these two. But if it's ever going to revert back to a classic, 16-12 Laval-Montreal matchup, it's going to be in this one in mid-November, in late season in the playoffs. So I'm interested to see not just who wins this game, but the dynamics of how the game looks this week as well. I like Montreal because of what we talked about earlier, but given the tepid performance against Concordia a couple weeks ago, you never know what could happen. They're not necessarily a lock, that's for sure.
What I always enjoyed about these championship games in Quebec was if you wanted to see offense, go to the other conferences. And then there would be this standalone, old school, you want rouges? Oh, we got rouges. You want multiple safeties? that was a given. A couple of field goals, maybe, and maybe more defensive touchdowns than offensive touchdowns. And I don't think that we're going to see that this week, but I'm still not convinced we're going to see two teams in the 20s. I still think that the first team to 17 is going to win this game, and I think that team's going to be Montreal. They've proven themselves over the course of the season. We just finished talking about some of the distractions at Laval, but Montreal has proven to be the better team in that conference this year, and I think that they can continue that in the postseason. So let's continue moving west. We'll go to the Yates Cup now, and you've got Western and you've got Laurier. They played a couple of weeks ago to determine home field in this game. So in the win over Windsor, Laurier looked really good early, and they looked really good offensively late, and in the middle was just a mess. Multiple turnovers in the red zone, but Elgersma, man, early, the offensive line gave him time, and he looked comfortable, he looked sharp. And then when they came back and then eventually won it, he looked like he did early, and his touchdown pass was a thing of beauty to win the football game. But the middle was a mess offensively. Western, I don't know how much better they were than Queens on Saturday, but what they did is they do what Western always does, and they discourage you mentally, and they grind you. And when you think you have momentum, they pull it away. Queens gets a pick six. On the ensuing kickoff, Western touchdowns. Kabongo runs it for 100 yards or so. It kills Queens. Queens defense, they start getting a little momentum. Zing, zing. Couple of long seam passes. Just beautiful throws by Hillock. Just fantastic. And then Queens looks like they might be able to get back in it. They're down a couple of scores. They fumble at their own 10-yard line late in the third quarter. They hold Western to a field goal instead of the touchdown, but mentally they were done. And Laurier can compete in this game and win this game if they don't make the same kind of mistakes. They don't allow Western the big play because Western has thrived on plays like that. So if Laurier can not turn the ball over in the red zone, you get good play from the quarterback, you keep them relatively clean, and you don't give up the big plays, they've got a real shot at this game. But if they self-destruct, Western could win by multiple scores.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on what the key is for me, and that's that Laurier had Western on the ropes when they played them in the regular season, and they couldn't close it out. And it felt like in watching that game, which I did watch the latter stages of that game, it felt like in watching that game that Laurier kind of just let their foot off the gas just a little bit, right? And it was okay, we're in this thing, let's grind out the last handful of points that we need to edge these guys out, instead of let's go for the frickin' throats here and make sure that these guys are done, because Western is never out of a football game. And unfortunately, they let Western hang around. They could not put them away, and Western pulls it out late, as they so often do. I believe that Laurier is in a position where they can learn the lessons from that game and pull this one off, but it's all going to fall on the shoulders of Taylor Elgersma, right? You alluded to it in the Windsor game. He made a couple of mistakes, turned the ball over a couple of times. They cannot afford for those kinds of things to happen if they are going to defeat Western in this game. But since I'm feeling like a gambling man this week, I like the upset special on this one too. I really do like what Laurier has as their backbone. They have the great quarterback play and that vertical passing attack they can lean on. They have had a very good performance out of their offensive line this year, and they showed that they can slug it out with Western the last time they had them. So I think they've got a real shot here, and I think this is going to be one of the more intriguing Yates Cups in the last number of years, because too often in the last handful of years, it's been just a Western coronation from about the middle of the second quarter on. I don't expect it to look like that this weekend. Anything could happen, but I don't expect it to look like that. And then back out in my neck of the woods, and it truly is in my neck of the woods for the first time since 1999, UBC hosting the Hardy Cup. And they are welcoming in a team that they are 2-0 against this season that needs to flip the script in the Alberta Golden Bears. And Alberta has been an outstanding story this year. It hasn't come out of nowhere. Let's be clear. Alberta has been quietly building for the last 3 or 4 seasons, and they finally feels like they've gotten into the upper echelon of the Canada West, where they're a legitimate title contender. Them winning this game in a vacuum would not be a shock, but in the grander scheme of things would be a pretty big surprise. If you were to tell somebody from the outset of this season that the Alberta Golden Bears would be winning the Canada West and likely representing the Canada West in the Vanier Cup, people would be pretty blown away by that. So you have a chance for a really great narrative if they're able to pull off the upset. On the flip side, though, UBC, hosting this game. It's likely going to be that classic West Coast mid-November, wet drizzle all day long. I would expect there to be probably a couple of sloppy plays caused by that wetness, and that adds an element of chaos to things that could make things really topsy-turvy. So I'm really interested to see this because it could go anyway. There could very well be offensive fireworks on both sides. Both teams are very capable. It could also end up being a bit of a weird one if the weather rolls in, as it often does this time of year on the West Coast. So that should be an interesting factor as well.
What I love about this the most is the storyline, because, we were talking about UBC earlier, and here was a team that at least the three of us thought were, really going to put on a performance this year. And then you get this little engine that could, the school that I don't think anybody expected to be playing in this game. And, it's a Chris Morris team. They've got great line play and they can run a football. And Gord, you touched on the point that I wanted to make, that if this is a dry track, this could be UBC all day, but wet weather can be an equalizer to a team that can run the football. And we know that Alberta can do that. So, if we want to have the pick, call the weatherman first. But with all things being equal, I'll lean toward your alma mater.
Games of the week coming up next. It is West Shore, the champion of the BCFC, hosting Saskatoon, the champion of the PFC, for the Canadian Bowl, the CJFL Championship, this Saturday. If you're in Victoria, you won't want to miss it. And welcome back, everyone. Time for Games of the Week. And who have you got, Mike?
I'll go Syracuse Pitt, I guess. That's the easy one. And for the family and friends of Christian Vieira, it's like a 3-hour drive. So this is a home game at Syracuse for him. Let's face it, after the first debut where he looked pretty good, he hasn't looked good the last couple of weeks, but his team got crushed like a grape. We'll see if he can bounce back a little bit. And then you got Damian Alford at Syracuse, who's had 3 really nice games this year. A little bit more consistent than we've seen in the past. We've been screaming for him to get the ball more. I think he's got 3 games now of 70 or more yards. So it's nice to see him bounce back. So a little Canadian content on both sides in this game.
I'm going to be heading out to the Great Mountain West to talk about the UNLV Runnin' Rebels. And guys, the Rebs are bowl eligible at 6-3. Jet Elad and his boys have been part of a huge turnaround at UNLV that the last time they won 6 games in a season was a decade ago. So it's been a really banner year for UNLV, but they don't have to stop there. They traveled to Laramie to play Wyoming, a very, very tough environment to play in. But if they can pull this one off, they've got a 2-game stretch where they play Wyoming and play Air Force. And if they win both those games, they're in the conference title game, which would be a fantastic accomplishment in the first year for Barry Odom there. So a big, big game for the Rebels. Jet Elad has been playing exceptionally well the last month or so. So he's a guy to watch out for. And one of the country's surprise teams go into a really unique and tough environment in Wyoming. It'll be a fun one.
So it is championship season in every corner of the country. What are you waiting